Pack it. You have until sunrise to get out of my house.
Your house.
Our lawyers will handle the rest. The kids stay here.
You have a 6 in the morning flight to New York. There's no one here to watch them.
That's not my problem anymore. Figure it out.
An envelope will arrive at your mother's office tomorrow morning. She should open it before the board meeting.
What envelope?
Ask Trevor.
You have nothing.
You are nothing.
My wife threw me out of our Brentwood home at midnight with a suitcase and a verdict she was completely certain of. She told me I had nothing, said it the way people say things that don't need proof, without hesitation, without doubt. She was wrong. She didn't know the man she dismissed as a dependent husband had spent 2 years building something she couldn't touch. She didn't know about the envelope. She didn't know about Beverly Hills. How much had the woman who called me worthless already lost without knowing it yet? If that question is already pulling at you, you're going to want to stay for this one. Stories like Elliot's don't come around often, and the ending is worth every minute. Hit subscribe if you haven't yet so you never miss the ones that matter. The suitcase she threw at my feet that night wasn't heavy. I had learned over 11 years not to accumulate things that couldn't survive being left behind. What I hadn't expected was how steady my hands were when I picked it up. Not because I was numb, not because I had stopped caring, but because I had spent the last 2 years making sure that when this moment arrived, I would already know exactly where I was going. Brianna stood in the doorway of the house her family owned, watching me with the certainty of someone who believed she held every card. She had no idea she had already played the one that would undo her. But to understand what happened that night, you have to go back 11 years. You have to understand who I was before the house in Brentwood, before the school runs and the pediatric appointments and the dinner parties where I stood at the edge of the room holding a glass of wine I never finished. You have to understand who I was when Brianna first looked at me like I was someone worth knowing, before she learned to look at me the way her mother always had. I grew up in a part of Los Angeles that didn't have a name people bragged about. My father was an electrician. My mother taught middle school science, and neither of them had connections that could open a door for me. What they gave me instead was a drafting table, a shelf of architecture books, and the expectation that if I wanted something, I would have to build it myself, sometimes literally. By the time I got to college, I had already taught myself 3 different design software programs, mostly because I couldn't afford the drafting tools the other students used, and learning the software was free if you were patient enough to find the right forums at 2 in the morning. I grew up understanding that the distance between where you started and where you wanted to go was not a wall. It was a project. You broke it into steps, and you worked the steps. It was in one of those late-night sessions during my junior year that a group of us started working on something we didn't have a name for yet. There were 4 of us architecture students, a civil engineering major, and a computer science graduate student named Kendra Miles, who had a habit of asking questions that made the rest of us realize we hadn't thought things through carefully enough. The idea started simple, a software framework for designing modular homes that could be adapted for extreme climate conditions. Fire-prone hillsides, flood zones, areas where traditional construction methods failed consistently. We had watched too many California neighborhoods disappear in a season and get rebuilt the same way in the same materials in the same configurations only to burn again. We wanted to design something different. What we built in that apartment eventually became Habitat Frame Technologies. At the time, it was just code and arguments and a lot of cold coffee. By the time I graduated and started working at a small architecture firm in Silver Lake, Habitat Frame existed on paper as a registered company with 4 co-founders, a set of filed patents, and almost no revenue. I held my shares, kept my name on the patent documentation, and kept working at the firm, while Kendra, who had more business sense than the rest of us combined, ran the day-to-day operations. It wasn't glamorous. For several years, it wasn't much of anything. But the patents were real. The company was registered, and my stake in it was documented and legally mine. I didn't talk about it much, not because I was embarrassed by it, but because there wasn't much to say about a company that hadn't yet become what you believed it could be. You hold those things quietly and keep working. I met Brianna Ashford at a fundraiser in Santa Monica 3 years after I graduated. The event was for disaster housing specifically for families who had lost homes in the fires that swept through Ventura County the previous year. I had been invited through the architecture firm more as a warm body to fill a table than as anyone important. Brianna was there representing Ashford Motion Group, which her family had been building for 2 decades into one of the more respected production companies in Century City. She was wearing a dark green dress and talking to a city council member with the fluency of someone who had grown up in rooms exactly like that one. What I remember is that she left the conversation mid-sentence when the council member started explaining something she clearly already knew, and she drifted to the edge of the room where I was standing, and she said without any preamble that the architectural renderings on the display wall were wrong, that the modular designs being proposed for the rebuild areas would not hold up to the wind shear conditions in those particular canyons. I looked at the renderings. She was right. We talked for 2 hours. I didn't think about the room we were in, or the people around us, or the fact that I was wearing a blazer I had borrowed from a colleague. I just thought about the conversation, and about the person I was having it with, and about the way she argued not to win but to figure something out. That quality is rarer than most people realize. We dated for a year and a half. During that time, Brianna's mother, Marjorie Ashford, made it quietly, and then not so quietly clear that she did not approve of the direction things were heading. Marjorie had spent decades building something not just a company, but a network of relationships, a reputation, a particular kind of standing in Los Angeles that required careful management. In her estimation, I brought nothing to that equation. I was an architect at a small firm with a stake in a startup that had no revenue and a name no one had heard of. She was not wrong about any of the facts. She was simply applying a framework for measuring value that had no category for what I actually was, which was a person still early in the process of becoming what he intended to be. She insisted on a prenuptial agreement before the wedding, and her attorneys drafted it. The document was designed to protect Ashford family assets, the real estate the company shares, the portfolio that had taken 3 generations to build. The language was thorough and the intent was clear. Nothing that belonged to the Ashford family before the marriage, or that was generated by Ashford family holdings during it, would be accessible to me under any circumstances. I read the full agreement with an attorney of my own, a detail that seemed to mildly offend Marjorie, as if the review itself implied I had something worth protecting. My attorney pointed out that the same clause which sealed off Ashford assets also confirmed in clear legal language that any intellectual property, patent rights, or equity I held prior to the marriage remained exclusively mine. Marjorie signed it without objection. In her mind, there was nothing on my side of the ledger worth the ink. She signed it the way you sign a receipt for something that has no value quickly without reading it twice. The document she treated as a formality would become 11 years later the thing that protected everything I had quietly built. Brianna and I got married on a Saturday in September at a property in Ojai that her family had rented for the occasion. It was a beautiful wedding, and I mean that without irony. The people were real, the vows were real, and the woman standing beside me that day was the woman I had chosen with full knowledge of what choosing her meant, including the family that came with her, and the particular weight Marjorie placed on everyone inside her orbit. Marjorie gave a toast that managed to be warm and faintly condescending at the same time, the kind of speech that sounds generous in the room, but leaves you with a slightly uneasy feeling when you replay it later. I didn't replay it. I was happy. I believed in the marriage and in the woman I had married and in the life we were building together, even if the building sometimes felt like it was happening on her terms and in her family's language. Henry was born 2 years after the wedding. He arrived quietly and seriously, already seeming to observe things that other newborns didn't notice. And from the first week I understood that this was going to be the great work of my life, in a way that no architectural project could be. Brianna was devoted in those early months. We were devoted together, and for a time the life we had built had the quality of something that might actually hold. 3 years after Henry, Lucy arrived early. She was born at 31 weeks and spent her first month in the NICU, and I sat beside that incubator for hours at a time, watching her breathe, measuring every small improvement against the fear that lived in my chest during all of those weeks. Brianna was at the hospital when she could be, but she had just been promoted to a position that made it difficult to disappear for extended periods, and we both understood without fully discussing it that I would be the one to stay. I left the architecture firm. I reduced my consulting work to a few manageable projects and arranged my hours around the children. Lucy came home. She was small and fierce and needed more careful attention than most children her age, and I was there for all of it. Every follow-up appointment, every specialist visit, every night she couldn't sleep, and needed someone to sit in the dark with her until the anxiety passed. I was the one who knew the pediatrician's name and the school schedule, and which of Henry's teachers he actually responded to. I was the one who planned the meals and managed the household and showed up for everything every time without exception. The decision made sense at the time, and I do not regret it, not then and not now. What I failed to account for was how permanent the reassignment of roles would become once it settled in, and how completely invisible that kind of work could become to the people who depended on it most. That kind of presence becomes invisible in the way that foundations are invisible. You only notice them when they're gone. Marjorie noticed me differently. In her version, I had simply accepted a comfortable arrangement at her daughter's expense. She called me at a family dinner in Hancock Park that I remember with precise clarity, a man who had chosen the easier path. She said it pleasantly, the way you might observe a weather pattern as though it were simply a fact about the world, rather than an assessment designed to sting. Brianna did not respond. Over the years, Brianna's silence on the subject had begun shifting from omission into something that felt closer to agreement. I watched it happen gradually, the way you watch a season change, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small ones, until one day you look around and realize the light has completely changed. I learned not to react. Not because I had surrendered, but because I understood that reacting in that room in that family's language would only confirm the story they had already decided to tell about me. I had spent enough time in my life building things that other people underestimated to know that the underestimation itself was sometimes the most useful thing you had. The watch arrived on the Tuesday. It was delivered to the house in Brentwood while Henry was at school and Lucy was napping, and I signed for it without any particular attention until I saw the name on the return label, and then after opening the outer packaging, the engraving on the back of the watch case. The initials were TL. The card inside was in Brianna's handwriting. She wrote about a night at a hotel in West Hollywood called the Larkspur, and she wrote that he made her feel like herself again, and she signed it with her first name. The gift wrap was from a jeweler on Rodeo Drive. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment holding the card, reading it again in case I had misread it the first time. I had not. Then I called the delivery service, explained that the package had been sent to the wrong address, and gave them the office address for Trevor Langley, a film producer who had become a frequent presence in Brianna's professional life over the past year. The kind of person whose name appeared regularly in her calendar and whose involvement in Ashford Motion Group projects had recently expanded well beyond what the projects seemed to require. I knew who TL was before I looked at the card a second time. That evening, when Brianna came home and asked with careful casualness whether anything had been delivered, I told her I hadn't seen any packages. She accepted this and moved to the next subject, and I watched her face for the rest of the evening and understood that she was very good at conducting two conversations at once, the one happening in the room and the one happening somewhere else entirely. A few weeks later, I was cleaning up after dinner when I picked up the family tablet to check Henry's school schedule. A message from Trevor was open on the screen. He had written about the room at the Larkspur and asked when they could get back to Aspen together. I read it twice, replaced the tablet exactly where I had found it, and finished loading the dishwasher. Over the following weeks, I began paying attention in a different way. Brianna had stopped sharing her location. She had changed her phone password for the first time in 4 years. She mentioned meetings that did not appear in the shared Ashford Motion Group calendar she had given me access to years ago for scheduling purposes. None of this was conclusive on its own. Together it formed a shape I already recognized. One afternoon, while Henry and Lucy were at a playdate, I drove to the Larkspur Hotel in West Hollywood and sat in my car in the guest parking structure for 40 minutes. Brianna's car arrived. Trevor Langley was driving. She got out on the passenger side and he came around and she embraced him the way people embrace when they are not performing for anyone, and they walked into the hotel together. I drove home. I picked up the children. I made dinner. I did not allow myself the luxury of falling apart because Henry and Lucy needed someone at the table who was present, and being present for them was the one thing I had decided a long time before that afternoon I was not going to stop doing regardless of what else happened around me. The last piece appeared about 2 weeks later, a folder Brianna had left in her home office. Inside was a printed itinerary for a private flight to Aspen. 2 passengers. Her name and Trevor's name side by side with a suite reservation at a property I knew was not used for Ashford business travel. I sat with all of it for 3 days before I made a decision. The anger was there. I would be dishonest if I said otherwise. But underneath the anger was something steadier, something that had been quietly building since the first dinner at Marjorie's, where I had been dismissed as irrelevant since the first time Brianna had accepted that dismissal without a word. I could confront Brianna that week in that house with the folder still on her desk. I knew what would happen. Marjorie's attorneys would mobilize within 48 hours. The story would become about a failed husband trying to extract what he could from a successful woman's family. I had no income of record, no property in my name, and no leverage in a fight conducted on those terms. I would lose not because I was wrong, but because I was fighting on ground that belonged entirely to the other side. Or I could wait. I could use the time that remained. I gave Brianna 6 months from the day I found the itinerary. Not as a punishment, not as a performance of patience. I simply decided that if she chose to end the affair and return to the marriage, in that time I would consider whether anything was still worth saving. If she did not, I would leave on my own terms, with everything in order. I contacted Kendra Miles. I had not spoken to her in almost 2 years. But Kendra answered as if no time had passed at all, because that is the kind of person she had always been. She told me that Habitat Frame had been quietly gaining traction with several major construction groups who were looking for fire-adaptive building technology. She told me the company was in conversations that could lead somewhere significant. She told me my shares were still on the books, and my name was still on the patents exactly where I had left them, exactly as the prenuptial agreement specified they would be. I began working again. Quietly after the children were asleep, consulting on small architectural projects and contributing to the Habitat Frame development pipeline that Kendra was managing. I documented everything, every hour, every payment, every transaction in a separate account handled exactly as the prenuptial agreement specified for assets originating from premarital holdings. The agreement that Marjorie's attorneys had drafted to protect her family had created a clean legal wall between Ashford assets and mine. For the first time, I understood that the wall cut both ways. After many years of being told in ways direct and indirect that I had no standing in that world, I sat down at a desk in the quiet of a house where everyone else was asleep, and I started building the ground I intended to stand on. The 6 months I gave Brianna were not months of waiting. Every morning I woke before the children made breakfast, checked Lucy's medications, reviewed Henry's homework from the night before, and then when the house was running and the kids were at school and the day had its shape, I sat down and worked. Not on the marriage, on the only thing I could control, which was making sure that when the 6 months ended however they ended, Henry and Lucy would have somewhere solid to land. I had come to understand in those months that the work I was doing at the desk after midnight was not separate from the work I was doing at the kitchen table before sunrise. It was the same work. It was building something that would last by whatever method the moment allowed. Brianna was not making it easy to hold on to hope, even if I had wanted to. She came home later as the weeks went on, sometimes after 11, occasionally past midnight. She missed Henry's winter concert at school, the one he had been rehearsing for since October, the one where he played a small solo on the recorder and looked out at the audience twice before his expression settled into something that tried very hard not to be disappointment. I was there with my phone camera and a jacket I had kept on the seat beside me. I told him afterward that he had done beautifully, and he said thank you in the quiet, careful way he had when he was managing something bigger than the words available to him. He didn't ask where his mother was. That particular question had stopped appearing sometime in the 2nd month, and its disappearance told me more than any conversation could have. Lucy stopped setting a place for Brianna at the dinner table sometime around the 2nd month. She didn't announce it or explain it. She simply stopped the way children absorb the shape of things before adults are ready to name them. In the evenings, she would bring her books to my room and sit on the bed beside me while I read to her. and I understood from the way she arranged herself, close, deliberate always with one hand touching my arm, that she was working something out in her own small and serious way. Children know the truth of their situation long before they have the language for it. Lucy had always been perceptive in that particular direction. She learned early in the NICU that the world was not always the safe place people told you it was, and that the safest bet was to stay close to the person who had never left. The dinner at Marjorie's house in Hancock Park happened in the 3rd month. It was a family gathering, the kind Marjorie organized periodically as a way of reminding everyone in the room that she was still the center of gravity in the Ashford orbit. There were cousins, a business associate of long-standing Marjorie's younger sister, who visited from Connecticut twice a year. Brianna was present and unusually warm that evening, the version of herself she performed when she needed to appear uncomplicated. I moved through the room and said the right things and refilled glasses when they needed refilling, because that is what I had learned to do in spaces where I was tolerated but not quite welcomed. Marjorie made her remark during the main course. She was talking about Ashford Motion Group's expansion plans, new production partnerships, a slate of projects that had been in development for 2 years, and somewhere in the middle of it she turned and included me in the conversation with the specific kind of inclusivity that is really its opposite, the kind that points at a person to demonstrate where the edges of the circle are. She said that, of course, not everyone at the table had to carry the weight of building something. She said that some people found their contribution in other ways, in managing the household, in being available, in providing what she called, and here she smiled, a supportive domestic environment. She said this pleasantly, gesturing toward me as an illustration of her point. No one corrected her. Brianna, seated 2 chairs down, reached for her wine. I looked at Marjorie steadily and said that I agreed completely, that the domestic environment was something I took seriously, and then I returned to my food. Marjorie seemed faintly dissatisfied by the absence of a reaction, the way a person who throws a stone into still water is unsatisfied when the water simply absorbs it. On the drive home that evening, I stopped at a red light on Beverly Glen and happened to glance at a car pulling up alongside mine. It was a company sedan. I recognized one of the vehicles Ashford Motion Group used for executive errands. The driver was someone I had seen at the Hancock Park house before, a man Marjorie used for what she called personal administrative matters. He was on a phone call, not looking in my direction, but the coincidence of seeing him on that particular road at that particular hour, heading in the direction I had come from, settled in me like a stone dropping into still water. I kept driving. I said nothing. I filed it away in the same place I had been filing everything else. 3 days later, Kendra called. She told me that Habitat Frame had received an unusual inquiry. A man who identified himself as conducting a financial background review had called one of the board members and suggested that my stake in the company might become subject to dispute in an ongoing marital proceeding. The board member had flagged it internally. The construction group that had been in preliminary acquisition conversations had put the process on hold. They didn't want to buy a company where the intellectual property ownership structure was under any kind of legal cloud, even a suggested one. Kendra's voice had that quality of controlled concern she used when she needed to deliver information without alarming the person she was delivering it to. I told her I would handle it. I could hear in the small silence that followed that she believed me. I already knew who had made that call. What I understood now was that Marjorie had not simply been watching. She had decided to move first, to introduce uncertainty into the one area where I was quietly building strength, hoping to collapse it before I could use it. It had the specific shape of her method, never direct, always plausibly deniable, always designed to make the target appear to be the aggressor if they responded. She had identified that my connection to Habitat Frame was the variable she couldn't account for, and she had reached for the only tool available to her, which was the suggestion of legal dispute. It was, in its way, a sophisticated move. It was also the move that confirmed she was more afraid of what I was building than she had let on. Kendra arranged an urgent meeting with Erica Stanton, whose name I had known for years through colleagues in the architecture and real estate space. Erica's practice focused on asset protection, divorce litigation, and intellectual property ownership, a combination that had made her the first call for more than a few people navigating situations exactly like the one I was now in. She had an office in Century City, 4 blocks from Brianna's building, which I found faintly ironic. I walked into her office with the prenuptial agreement, the habitat frame incorporation documents, the patent filing records, and the equity allocation records from the company's founding. I laid them on her desk in the order they had been created. She worked through them methodically and without any visible reaction until she reached the prenuptial agreement's asset classification clause, at which point she looked up at me with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was close to one. She explained that the document Marjorie's attorneys had drafted was thorough, well-constructed, and in protecting Ashford assets from any claim by me, had also created a clean and legally enforceable separation between those assets and any property I held through premarital holdings. The patents were filed before the wedding. The equity was allocated before the wedding. The prenuptial agreement written by attorneys hired by Marjorie herself confirmed in plain language that those assets were mine and mine alone entirely outside the marital estate. Any suggestion that my stake in Habitat Frame was subject to marital dispute was in Erica's precise phrasing without legal basis. She prepared a formal response to the construction group's legal team, a letter accompanied by the relevant documentation demonstrating that the ownership structure was stable, clean, and not subject to any legitimate claim by a future ex-spouse. She also sent a separate communication to the financial investigator, informing him in direct terms that further interference with a private business transaction on behalf of an undisclosed client would carry consequences she was prepared to detail in a more formal setting. The acquisition process resumed within 10 days. I paid Erica's retainer from my consulting account and thanked her with the sincerity that comes from understanding exactly how close something came to going wrong. She told me to stay in touch. I understood that I would need to. The moment that ended whatever remained of my hope came in the 5th month. Brianna came home in the early evening, unusual enough that Lucy ran to the entryway when she heard the door. But something had happened that day. I could see it in the set of Brianna's shoulders in the way she moved through the house without fully settling in any room. She had the look of someone who had been in an argument that hadn't resolved and was carrying it still. She dropped her bag on the kitchen counter and began going through her work folders, and Lucy, who had been coloring at the kitchen table with a focused intensity she applied to everything, reached across for a crayon and knocked a full glass of water directly onto a stack of Brianna's printed documents. The response was immediate and disproportionate. Brianna's voice filled the kitchen in a way that made Lucy go very still, the way small animals go still when something larger moves too fast nearby. She said that Lucy needed to learn to be careful, that the documents were important, and then she turned to me and said that this was what happened when children had no boundaries, when they were indulged to the point of believing that nothing in the world had consequences. Her voice was not shouting, which was in some ways worse. It had the cold precision of someone who had decided that the room would reorganize itself around her frustration, and who had been doing this long enough that she no longer considered whether it was appropriate. Lucy slid off her chair and came to stand beside me, and I put my hand on her shoulder and felt her leaning into it with the full weight of a child who has learned exactly which direction safety is. I told Brianna as calmly as I could manage that Lucy had made an accident, that it was a glass of water, and that whatever else was happening today did not belong in this room with these children. Brianna looked at me with an expression I had not seen before. Not contempt exactly, but something that treated the idea of my opinion as an irrelevance so complete it didn't even merit a full response. She said I had no standing to tell her how to behave in her own home. She said the home existed because she paid for it. She picked up the damp documents and left the kitchen. I took Lucy to her room and sat with her until she was calm enough to eat dinner. She asked me that night, in the small, serious voice she used for questions she had been holding for a while, whether Mommy was mad at her. I told her that Mommy was tired, and that tired people sometimes used bigger voices than they meant to. Lucy considered this carefully, the way she considered everything, and then said that when she was tired, she didn't get to use a bigger voice. I did not have a good answer for that. I held her until she fell asleep, and then I sat in the hallway outside her room for a long time in the dark, and I understood that I had been waiting for Brianna to choose the marriage, and that what I had just watched happen in the kitchen was its own kind of answer. The 6-month deadline arrived the following week. Brianna had not ended anything with Trevor. The acquisition at Habitat Frame closed in the weeks that followed. The distribution of proceeds was governed by the equity allocation that had been in place since the company's founding, and my share produced a number I will not pretend I had fully anticipated, even knowing what the shares represented. It was the kind of number that changes the geometry of what is possible, that transforms the question from whether you can leave to where you will go when you do. I deposited my portion into accounts that had been structured and documented carefully over the preceding months. Kendra knew. Erica knew. The paper trail was clean, well-organized, and consistent with everything the prenuptial agreement had established. I told no one else. I did not buy a new car. I did not change my routine in any visible way. I continued making school lunches and attending parent-teacher conferences and showing up to every small event that mattered to Henry and Lucy, because that was what I had always done, and it was not contingent on anything else in my life. Privately working with Kendra and Erica, I structured the investments that would follow a portion into a real estate trust, a portion into long-term bonds, a portion into early-stage development of fire-resistant housing projects. I had been thinking about since the night I met Brianna at that Santa Monica fundraiser, in a life that now felt like it had belonged to someone slightly different from the person sitting at the desk in the small room off the hallway. And then there was the property. I found it through a broker. Kendra recommended a house in Trousdale Estates in Beverly Hills that had come on the market quietly, the kind of listing that doesn't appear on public sites because the seller prefers discretion. The house sat on a lot with a view of the city that at night reduced Los Angeles to a grid of light that stretched to the horizon. It had a garden large enough for 2 children to actually live in a room with east-facing windows that would be perfect for a boy who liked to build things, and enough space that 3 people could inhabit it fully without ever feeling crowded. It had the bones of a place that could be a home rather than a residence. I made an offer. The transaction was clean, documented, precisely funded entirely from assets that predated the marriage and were protected explicitly by the agreement Marjorie had insisted I sign 11 years ago. I furnished the house over several months, working slowly and without urgency because I was not yet ready to move, and because there was something clarifying about having a destination that existed in complete silence. Nobody from Brianna's world knew it was there. I had taken enough care with the documentation that even a thorough financial investigation of the kind Marjorie had already attempted would find only a clean trail that led back to exactly what I said. It was premarital assets properly managed, legally protected, and entirely my own. The night Brianna came home and told me she wanted a divorce. I was sitting in the kitchen reading an article Henry had asked me about for a school project. She walked in, still wearing her coat, and there was something in the way she held herself, a decision already made, a conversation that had been rehearsed. She told me the marriage was over. She told me the house in Brentwood belonged to her family and I would need to leave. She said it clearly, without cruelty, but without any particular softness. The way you announce something you have concluded requires no further discussion. I told her I agreed the marriage was over, and I told her I would go. Something about that answer didn't land the way she expected. I could see her recalibrating, looking for the argument that wasn't coming, and in the absence of it, she reached for the suitcase in the entryway closet and set it at my feet and told me to take what I needed for tonight. She said the children would stay at the house. She said we could work out the custody through attorneys. I reminded her quietly about her flight to New York in the morning, the 6 a.m. departure she had mentioned at dinner 3 days earlier. I reminded her that there was no one staying in the house that night to care for Henry and Lucy. I was not asking her permission to take the children. I was stating a fact about the situation she had constructed, one she didn't have a ready answer for, because the fact was simply true. She told me to get out and take them with me if I wanted them so badly. I think she meant it as a punishment. I went upstairs and packed bags for Henry and Lucy, and I woke them gently and told them we were going somewhere together, that I would explain more in the morning, that they were safe. Henry watched my face and asked, with the particular perception he had always had, whether things were going to be okay. I told him they were going to be more than okay. Before I walked out, I turned back to Brianna and told her that an envelope would be delivered to her mother's office first thing in the morning, and that Marjorie should open it before the board meeting. The envelope contained photographs, messages, flight itineraries, hotel records, and expense documentation showing that the Aspen trips, The Larkspur Hotel stays, and the private aviation bookings had all been processed through Ashford Motion Group accounts, categorized as business development expenditure across at least 18 months. Brianna's expression changed in a way I had not seen before. The certainty dropped out of it, entirely replaced by something she was working hard to contain. She asked what envelope. I told her to ask Trevor. I picked up the suitcase she had set at my feet, and I carried it out to my car. Henry and Lucy were already buckled in the back seat. I started the engine and pulled out of the driveway of the house in Brentwood for the last time, and I drove south, then west, and then up into the hills above the city where the lights of Los Angeles spread out below us like something I had been building toward for longer than I knew. The gate at Trousdale Estates opened on a keypad code I had memorized months ago and never used until that night. I pulled through slowly, and in the back seat, Henry leaned forward against his seatbelt and looked at the house at the end of the driveway the way it sat against the hill with the city spread out behind it, every window dark except for the exterior lights I had set on a timer. He was quiet for a long moment in the way he got quiet when he was processing something too large for immediate comment. Then he asked me in a careful voice whose house this was. I told him it was ours. He looked at me the way he sometimes did when he suspected an adult was simplifying something important, and then he looked back at the house and something in his expression shifted, not quite relief, but the beginning of it. Oh. Lucy had fallen asleep against his shoulder somewhere on the drive up through the hills. I carried her inside and she barely stirred, only tightened her grip around my neck with the automatic trust of someone who has learned that the person holding her will not put her down somewhere unsafe. I settled her in the bedroom I had furnished for her, the one with the window seat that caught the morning light, and sat with Henry until he had seen enough of the house to feel oriented in it. He asked if there was a room where he could set up his models. I showed him the one I had already chosen for him with the long work table along the east wall. He stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment, and then turned back to me and said he had a lot of questions. I told him that was fair, and that we had time, and that right now the most important thing was sleep. He accepted this with the particular discipline he had always had, the quality that made him seem at 8 years old, like someone who understood that some conversations required the right conditions before they could be had properly. After he was in bed, I stood alone in the main living room for a long time. The room was finished. I had worked on it over several months, not extravagantly, but carefully choosing things that felt like they belonged to a life rather than a display. There were books on the shelves, real ones I had moved over in boxes across several trips. There was a reading lamp in the corner that I had bought at an estate sale in Pasadena because it had the exact quality of light I wanted for that specific corner. Below the wide rear windows, Los Angeles stretched to the horizon in a grid of amber and white that on clear nights seemed to extend all the way to the edge of the world. I had looked at that view on the day I first walked through the property and known immediately and without deliberation that this was the right place. Not because of what it represented, because of how it felt to stand in its solid quiet and entirely mine. I had told myself across all the months of building this quietly that when this moment arrived I would feel something clean and decisive. What I felt instead was something slower and more complicated. A kind of accumulated weight releasing all at once without warning in the middle of a room that was finally simply mine. I sat in the chair by the window and let it happen. I am not a man who cries easily, and I don't describe what happened that night as breaking down. It wasn't that. It was closer to the sensation of having held something under significant pressure for a very long time and being allowed at last to set it down. The tears came, and then they stopped. And afterward I felt more like myself than I had in years. Not the self I had been performing in the Brentwood house, but the self that had existed underneath that performance, the one who had kept working in the dark, who had kept showing up, who had never fully accepted the story the Ashford family had told about what kind of man he was. Across the city in an office building in Century City, an envelope was waiting. I had arranged for it to be delivered to Marjorie Ashford's personal office at 7 in the morning, early enough to arrive before the board meeting she held on the first Wednesday of every month. The contents were organized the way Erica had helped me think through, not as a weapon, but as a document. A clear chronological record that told a complete story without editorializing. There were photographs taken outside the Larkspur Hotel, date-stamped and unambiguous. There were the printed flight itineraries from the Aspen trips. There were copies of the messages from the shared family tablet. And there was the section Erica had identified as most consequential, a detailed breakdown of Ashford Motion Group expense records, showing hospitality charges, private aviation bookings, and hotel accommodations, corresponding exactly to the dates of Brianna's time with Trevor Langley. All of it processed through company accounts. All of it categorized as business development expenditure, across 18 months. Marjorie opened the envelope before the board convened. She was a woman who had spent decades managing the Ashford name, which meant she understood almost immediately what she was holding and what it meant. Not just for Brianna, for the company. For the reputation that the Ashford family had built in the Los Angeles media and entertainment landscape. The one that Marjorie had cultivated with the care of someone who understood that reputation is infrastructure invisible until it fails and catastrophic when it does. She did not call Brianna first. She called the company's general counsel, and then she called two of the longest-standing board members, and then she convened an emergency session before the scheduled meeting had even started. The board requested an internal audit of the expense categories in question. Within 48 hours, the audit confirmed what the envelope already showed. Brianna was placed on administrative leave from her role as president pending the board's full review. Marjorie busted herself facing a truth that had no comfortable interpretation. The man she had dismissed as a domestic dependent had spent 2 years protecting her grandchildren and gathering evidence in silence while the daughter she had defended at every turn had been risking the company's reputation on a hotel room in West Hollywood. When the information about the new owner of the Trousdale Estates property reached the people who follow that kind of thing in Los Angeles, it traveled quickly. Within days, Brianna and Marjorie arrived at my gate. I met them outside rather than inside because I saw no reason to give the conversation more territory than it required. Marjorie got out of the car first. She looked at the house behind me, really looked at it, taking in the scale of it the way it sat in the hillside, and I watched her doing the arithmetic that Brianna was also visibly doing. The arithmetic that started with the property's obvious value and worked backward through the question of how I could possibly have come to own it. Brianna spoke first. She said that assets accumulated during a marriage were marital property, that she would be entitled to a significant portion in any divorce proceeding, and that I should understand my legal position. I handed her a copy of the prenuptial agreement. I let her find the relevant clause, and I waited while she read it. Then I explained as clearly as I could what the document she was holding actually said. The habitat frame equity had been established before the wedding. The patents had been filed before the wedding. The prenuptial agreement, drafted by attorneys her mother had hired, reviewed by her mother's legal team, and signed by her mother as a condition of the marriage, confirmed in plain language that any assets originating from those premarital holdings belonged to me entirely outside the marital estate. The proceeds from the acquisition, the investments that followed, the property at the address where we were currently standing, all of it traced back to a stake in a company that had existed before Brianna and I had ever met. I looked at Marjorie when I finished. I did not need to say what was evident to all three of us: the document she had insisted upon 11 years ago, the one she had treated as a formality because she could not imagine I had anything worth protecting, had performed precisely the function it was designed to perform. It had protected assets, simply not the ones she had intended. She had built the legal wall herself with her own attorneys in her own language, and now she was standing on the wrong side of it. Marjorie's expression did not change dramatically. She was too controlled for that. But something behind it shifted the specific quality of silence that comes over a person when they understand that they have made a consequential error and that the error is not correctable. Brianna tried one more approach. She said the children should be with her, that she had the resources to provide for them. I told her that from that point forward, every conversation about custody would happen through Erica Stanton, and that the record of who had been present in Henry and Lucy's lives would speak for itself in any proceeding. I said this without anger because the anger had largely left me by then, replaced by something more durable and less exhausting. I closed the gate behind me and went back inside to make breakfast for my children. The legal proceedings that followed were not brief, but they moved in only one direction. Brianna's attorneys argued that the assets should be considered marital property because they had produced their value during the marriage. Erica dismantled this argument methodically, presenting the incorporation records, the patent filing dates, the equity allocation tables, and the prenuptial agreement's explicit asset classification language. The court found that the assets were what the documents said they were. Brianna had no claim on the house. The custody question took longer and mattered more. I did not use the affair as the centerpiece of my argument because I was not interested in conducting a proceeding designed to humiliate Brianna or give Henry and Lucy a detailed account of their mother's failures. What I focused on was the record, the school calendars, the medical appointment logs, the teacher conferences, the pediatric specialist visits for Lucy, the years of documentation that showed appointment by appointment and school event by school event who had been there. The court awarded me primary physical custody. Brianna received regular visitation on a structured schedule because she was still their mother and because the children needed that relationship to survive in a form they could eventually make sense of. I did not contest the visitation. I had never been trying to remove her from their lives. I had been trying to secure my place in them. Ashford Motion Group's board required Brianna to reimburse the company for the personal expenses processed through company accounts, and she stepped down from the presidency during the restructuring period. The relationship with Trevor Langley did not survive the removal of the conditions that had sustained it without the company resources, the private travel and the discretion that Brianna's position had provided. The arrangement lost the architecture that had held it together, and it ended without much ceremony. Marjorie did not disappear from Los Angeles. People like Marjorie Ashford do not disappear, they recalibrate. But the particular form of influence she had exercised in the city's business community, built partly on the image of a family that managed its affairs with intelligence and discretion, had taken damage that could not be entirely repaired. The people who had heard her describe me as a domestic dependent, a man without ambition or standing, now knew the fuller story. The knowledge changed the weight of her authority in certain rooms, and she knew it, and that was sufficient. The months that followed the divorce settlement had a quality I had not experienced in so long that I had almost forgotten it was available to me. They were simply mine. Not managed, not performed, not navigated. Mine. Henry claimed the workroom I had chosen for him and filled the long table with architectural models he assembled from kits and then modified, changing the roof lines, adjusting the proportions, asking me questions about structural load distribution that led on several evenings to conversations that lasted past his bedtime without either of us noticing. He would look at something he had built, tilt his head, say that it wasn't right yet, and then quietly take it apart and begin again. I recognized that impulse. I understood it in a way that made those evenings feel like something more than homework. Lucy planted a garden in the section of the yard that caught afternoon sun, working with a focused determination that reminded me every time I watched her of the quality she had demonstrated in her earliest weeks, smaller than most people believed possible and simply stubbornly insisting on existing. The garden grew. She tended it with the seriousness of someone who understood that things needed daily attention to become what they were supposed to be. I returned to Habitat Frame in a formal capacity, working with Kendra on the strategic direction of the company following the acquisition. The new parent organization had resources and distribution channels the company had never had before, and I was interested in what could be done with them, specifically in scaling the fire-adaptive housing designs toward affordability. The neighborhoods that burned repeatedly in California were not, for the most part, wealthy neighborhoods. The people who rebuilt in the same configurations, in the same materials, were not doing so because they lacked the intelligence to understand the risk. They were doing so because safer alternatives were not available at prices they could access. I had been thinking about this problem since a fundraiser in Santa Monica more than a decade earlier. I was finally in a position to work on it in ways that might actually produce results. The program I eventually established was focused on connecting people who had left professional careers to provide full-time care for family members with resources for re-entry into employment, into entrepreneurship, or into the simpler project of understanding what their skills were still worth, after years of being told in ways direct and indirect that those skills didn't count. The caregiving itself had never been the problem. The problem was the system of assumptions that treated presence and consistency and daily attention as economically invisible. I knew something about that from the inside. The knowledge felt like the right material to build something from. The message from Brianna came several months after the divorce was finalized at 11:47 at night. She wrote that she was sorry. She wrote that she had not understood while it was happening how much I had sacrificed, not as a figure of speech, but in concrete, innumerable ways. She wrote that she had confused stillness with absence, that she had looked at my patience and seen passivity, that she had accepted her mother's framework for measuring worth without ever questioning whether it was the right framework for measuring mine. She wrote that she understood if I didn't respond. I read the message twice. I set the phone down on the table by the window and looked at the lights of Los Angeles for a while. The apology was real, I believed that. Brianna had always been capable of genuine reflection when she was willing to do it, and whatever else had happened between us, I did not think she was a person without conscience. But an apology, even an honest one, is not a restoration. It does not replace the years when Henry looked for her at school concerts and found an empty seat. It does not give Lucy back the evenings she spent carrying books to my room because she had learned not to wait. The things that had been broken gradually in small increments across a long time, and they did not reassemble because someone had finally found the language to describe them accurately. I did not respond. Not from cruelty and not from the satisfaction of withholding. I genuinely felt neither of those things. I simply understood that there was no reply I could give that would be more honest than the silence itself. On a Saturday in late spring, I stood on the upper terrace and watched Henry and Lucy in the garden below. Henry was explaining something to his sister, gesturing at the raised beds she had planted with the architectural precision of a person who had recently become interested in the way growing things use available space. Lucy was listening with the skeptical attention she gave most of his theories, taking it seriously while reserving the right to disagree. The afternoon light came at a low angle through the eucalyptus at the edge of the property and fell across both of them in a way I would have liked to hold still. Brianna had believed the night she set that suitcase at my feet that she was ending something. She was right about that. But she had misread completely what she was ending and what she was not. She was ending a marriage that had run out of everything that marriages need to survive. She was not ending me. She was not ending the years of quiet work that had been accumulating in the background of a life she thought she understood. She was not ending the children's relationship with the parent who had been present for all of it, every appointment and concert and ordinary Tuesday and frightening night without exception, and without making it a point of negotiation. She had told me I had nothing. The gate behind me, the garden below the city spread out to the horizon, none of that was ever really the point. The point was simpler than a house and more durable than a balance sheet. I had been there, every single time, and I was still here. If Elliot's story stayed with you, I think it's because somewhere in it is something most of us already know, but rarely hear. Said plainly, the person who shows up every single day quietly, without applause, without a salary attached, is not the lesser person in the room. Presence is not weakness. Consistency is not smallness. Choosing to care for the people you love, even when the world assigns no economic value to that choice, is never something you should have to apologize for. And the quiet work, the work done after midnight, the work no one sees, the work that gets called nothing because it doesn't fit on a resume, that work is real. It counts. And sometimes it's exactly what you need to build everything back on your own terms. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the ones about people who hold their ground, build in silence, and let the truth speak for itself, then subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There are more stories like this one waiting. Every single one of them is worth your time.